Hello, Karl. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Andy. Pleased to be back here.
It's good to have you. I think it's more or less a year since we had a conversation about the festival last year, the Festival of Research, which is now the Festival of Innovation, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it is, and I'm really looking forward to it this year. So that'll be great. But it must be almost a year. You're right.
It's and I think I've done nearly 20 episodes of this podcast now. It's incredible to hear the different stories of each individual researcher. Everyone's had such quite varied journeys into their research, which is where we kick off our conversation with you today, which is always a really interesting thing for me to ask people is, where did you begin? How did you get into research?
Yeah, no problem at all. So I started with I was fortunate to have a funded PhD. So I started off looking at issues of financial exclusion, really, in low-income communities in Salford and in Portsmouth. And I worked for a colleague called Bob Patterson there, who was my supervisor and sort of mentor on that side of it. I think really, for me, the journey for research is a journey of impact, really. Though I have to say, when we started, we didn't have a notion of impact. This is, back at the early part of the century. What we were doing really is saying, okay, what's the problem and what are the potential solutions? And we started very much, and Bob was always focused on, which is sort of, which I sort of consumed really, which was, it's not enough to say what's the academic analysis of the issue. You actually have to come up with some solutions, especially when you're working in deprived communities, because you are not, it's not an anthropological piece of work. You have impact by just being there, and people's expectations rise. If you show an interest, you have to do something back. So we did that piece of work, and it sort of came up with a series of recommendations of creating a new type of financial institution. So we did that, and then what happened was that Lloyds and Barclays Bank approached us and said, we'll give you some more money, but we want you to actually build these institutions. Now, I have to say that this was not what I expected my academic career to start off doing, building financial institutions. And obviously it's not my specialism. So we then had to build a team of people that actually knew how to build things, as opposed to people that could write about things. So there was a lot of very fast learning from my part to sort of get up to speed. And we've had ex-bankers involved and a whole range of different parties. And then we built a couple of institutions, built a couple of financial institutions that basically are aimed at serving low-income neighbourhoods, doing loans to them, affordable credit, etc., which the type of model we were looking at wasn't available. So that's what the originality was. And then that sort of ended up with us receiving this little baby here, which is the Times Higher Award in 2005 for outstanding contribution to the local community.
Wow, so we're pre-impact here. We're pre-language of that.
Yeah, we didn't call it impact, we call it benefit, I think, really, and contribution.
Yeah. No, which is a better word, really.
No, exactly. And impact wasn't there. And that sort of piece of work, we also got a prize in Europe as well for continuation of that work. And so out of that, we then had more confidence. We then created 8 more institutions in cities, but also in rural England as well, looking at problems of rural England. And I think the other day you had Paul Vick, his case study, etc. And Paul and I have worked together for many years. So it's a sort of, a labour of love. And we met colleagues from the European Commission, and we were the only ones that were doing work at the time for another piece of research, which was looking at, the productivity of these institutions. How can you improve their productivity and performance? Because it's hard, the margins are very thin if you're going to do it not for profit. Mm-hmm. And so we've done sort of a piece of work for Esme Fairburn looking at productivity, and the Commission were really interested because there was none of that across Europe at all in terms of microfinance. And the Commission then approached us, and we had a long series of discussions with them. And then we started work with the Commission towards the Code of Conduct for Microfinance, which obviously is what Paul talked about with you the other day. And that's been a labour of love, really, for Paul and myself. But Paul has done most of the work there, as obviously I've moved through the university management system. But impact is definitely part of my research journey. In fact, it's been probably the dominant part of my research journey ever since we started.
Well, I want to come on to that sort of heritage around impact, given that this is a kind of theme for the series this month. But first of all, the origin then for you, was it economics? Was your sort of foundation in economics, or where were you sort of situated?
No, my first degree was in sociology and politics. And my PhD was in what I would describe as economic sociology.
Okay, I see.
Because my PhD was looking at the building societies as they were then, as large mutuals, and they were all being, or the larger ones were being broken up and sold and converting into becoming banks, what's known as demutualisation. You would have known Halifax and Leeds and Abbey National, for example, all converting to banks. This is long before the crash, etc., when those same institutions who converted were the ones that actually went under, Northern Rock being the most notorious of those. And it was the juxtaposition of that process at the same time that government policy was trying to create new forms of mutual organisations, financial organisations, with the rise of credit unions. And I was fascinated by this. Seemed to be a total paradox. You're pushing closing the largest of these mutual organisations at the same time saying mutuals are great and we're going to create some new ones that are even weaker and smaller, etc. It just didn't seem things. So that's one research. So it was that sort of sociology of trust and mutuality, along with that sort of economic understanding, sort of financial system. And for me, that's always been quite important. That I think the problem with economics is it forgets people, but sometimes the problem with sociology, it forgets the money. And you need to understand both to have a better sense of what's happening around us.
Well, it's really interesting that you mentioned the word trust, because in a lot of the conversations with our impact case study leads, the emphasis is very much on sort of social justice, about thinking about the needs of the most vulnerable, which seems to be quite a core theme in what Salford University is doing, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think one of the reasons for that is the regional purpose of the university. The university wasn't created to be like other universities in what happened. So if you look back towards the Robbins Review in the 1960s, and you look at the associated papers that led to the creation of Salford and similar types of institutions across the UK, what you can see is quite a big debate in government about whether, as they wanted to increase the number of student numbers, do they just increase the number of student numbers, or did they at the time want something different in different types of institutions? So it could have been very easy, for example, to have just redistribute the student numbers to the existing institutions, the existing rubrics. But the government, and this is both political parties, were clear that what they wanted to do was different types of organisations had a different set of mission, far more focused on, changing the economy and disrupting the status quo, to build in Hal Wilson's famous phrase, the white heat of technology, that transformational part of both society, and that sense of, in the late 50s and early 60s, that Britain was post-colonial, but hadn't yet really built a new future. And there was that new future, a sort of social democratic model that was coming out of Attlee's government, which was partly working, but there's still a sense, it's still, people forget just how conservative with a small c Britain was in the 1950s and early 1960s, most of the 1960s as well. And the universities these new universities I saw were supposed to do that, and they were supposed to be disruptive. And I think that's in the university's DNA, and I think it's still there in its DNA. Therefore, that social mission and that sort of economic and transformative mission, I think, is very strong, and it plays through a lot of the work. And I think it's the reason the colleagues that stay at Salford and join Salford find it such a quite intoxicating environment and want to remain here and want to change the world.
Well, certainly speaking to our impact case study leads, it's really clear just how much of a life commitment these programs of work really are. Often they're not just projects, they're actually part of bigger programs of work that have gone on sometimes for decades in the case of some colleagues. And I think we don't often talk about the sort of origin of impact within the research excellence framework, but also in the university sector as well. It sounds very clear in your own sort of research journey that was central to what you wanted to do. But do you have a sense in which there was a point where impact became suddenly visible, suddenly important to the sector more widely?
I suspect, obviously technically, when it was included in REF2014 as a measure, then at that point, everyone's suddenly become an expert on impact and, etc. But I think that's really unfair on the sector, because I think there's always been impact for research, although it has to be said, for much of the 20th century, an awful lot of impact for research wasn't done inside universities. And I suppose the most famous example of that, of course, is Bletchley Park, really, where you could say, there was research, primary mathematics, that had a direct impact on the most important event of the 20th century, etc. But, so you could say that was the first known big impact of it. But of course, it wasn't like the university. They were coming out of the universities to win in a war situation. In the post-war period, there was a gradual sort of move towards, that sort of sense of we have to do more externally, and universities need to start justify it. I think you really start to look at sort of, during Thatcher's time as Prime Minister, where there was quite a lot of movement for universities to get involved in the economy, especially in sort of places with the economy thing. And there was a lot of sense that universities do that. But even then, all the papers at the time seemed to be suggesting that the universities weren't quite the place for it. They weren't quite in the right space, or only some of the universities were in the right space. And the chief science officers were a bit concerned about some of that. So you then get, I think it's sort of, I suppose in some respects, the late 1990s and into the early 21st century, where you start to see, this notion of benefit becomes stronger and stronger as part of a function of higher education's role. And then, of course, you end up with it, including the REF. And at that point, it becomes codified, it becomes established, and it becomes incorporated into what academics do, and therefore what is valued by universities in itself. So I think that's the sort of history of it, in my interpretation.
I mean, it's interesting to hear that, because I think it's certainly at these times we're thinking about the sort of function and purpose of universities. And another theme that came through in lots of the conversations with impact case study leads was just how inherently collaborative their research is. And I think often it's tempting to think that you go through a university, you do your degree, you do your PhD, and then you're sort of this isolated researcher. It's very far from that with these case studies. And certainly building those collaborations early on in your research journey just seems so critical these days, doesn't it?
Yeah, I also think impact is, and that research in general, but it is co-produced, it's co-created. The phrase "no man is an island." I think there's an image of, as you say, of the academic, of the of the lone researcher in the gallery, which obviously comes from the sort of, I suppose, the monastic tradition of learning. That image, but and again, that's a misreading of the monastic tradition, because the other part of them is just how communal those societies were. That learning was a shared endeavour, even then. So, but there's always been that sense that knowledge is a transferable thing. If you look at historically, why, if you look outpouring of intellectual thing fought in Edinburgh in the 18th century, but it's interesting that it's a collection of people. It isn't just one great thinker, and it's that historically that seems to be a recurring feature. That you rarely get one person all on their own solves all these issues. They tend to be part of a network and a team, and I think that's all the way through. I think what impact has helped us do, or helps get in, and I think we've still got a journey to play on it in academia, is it's a better sense that the people that we're working with to change their lives are part of the co-production. It isn't us doing it to them, as a sort of paternalistic approach. Actually, really done well, I think, the work where impact works really well is where, yes, we have our knowledge, but at the same time, we recognise that there is expertise, the people that we're working with, and that needs to come out as well. So I think that's where we're going in the future.
I think that's such a crucial message, especially when thinking about early career researchers and PhD students. I think understanding that relationship is so critical. Well, thinking about our journey as an institution, then obviously we must talk about the REF results, which came out just a couple of weeks ago. I think it's a couple of weeks ago. Now time is flying very quickly, but lots of very happy faces around the university, lots of positivity, and I gather there was a celebration yesterday with the health school.
Yes, there was indeed, and I think that's right. And there's a point where you need to celebrate, and I think it's really important as an institution that you sometimes step back and you reflect and you celebrate, and then we can get back to it. And the results are fantastic. There's no way to sort of say they're not, really. I mean, we've risen 22 places. I was really pleased, and we've talked about impact quite a lot here. We're ranked 51st for impact. I said it yesterday, I've said it all week. We missed out on top 50 by 0.01. That will smart, I have to say, for quite some time.
Frustrating.
but nevertheless, that's a fantastic achievement. I was really pleased with the general quality, and we definitely focused on quality. It was definitely a sense of, the important part of what we do is really high quality research. 80% of research 3 or 4 star. all the panels had, excellence there throughout them, etc. And it was just a fantastic set of results. And I remember getting the results on the Monday and going through them, and you get the results first. You get your institutional results the first day, but you don't get the results of the sector. So you sort of look at it and you're sort of worried about, essentially grade inflation is what you're concerned about. You say, oh, well, they look really good, good for us, of course, from the office perspective, is the results we predicted, the results we got. So it was accurate. So that was good, but it didn't tell us much. But I was pleased by that, because I said all along, you can't control what happens elsewhere. All you can do is control our own. But I'm really pleased with the performance. Really pleased that all the colleagues that put so much effort in, and I know how much time it took, not just the submission leads that had to work long hours and put up with my hectoring, etc., to get it done in a particular way, etc., and the sort of systems and processes that we put in place. But everyone across the university that sort of contributes in a way they probably don't realise they're contributing, where they cover for a colleague, or they just offer a supportive word, or they're out marketing, etc. And I think these, and I said yesterday to colleagues and Health and Safety, I mean this, it is about Team Salford. It isn't about one individual, and etc. And that's a team effort. It's a collective effort of the whole university, and everyone across the university should be rightly proud of what we've achieved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things I loved about the impacts when it was initially launched as a part of the program, was just how inclusive they can be. So you can have multiple people involved, and it is that very collaborative aspect to working on them and building those really strong relationships with the partners as well that help to develop them. So thinking about the future, I suppose it's, as you say, it's nice to celebrate for a bit. I think the impact case studies are really interesting. We always have talked about, over the last decade, I guess, impact becoming a bigger part of what's expected of researchers. What's your sense of the direction in the sector with impact at this stage?
I think impact is now really well established in the sector. I mean, I've seen since the REF, there's been, one or two people that are quite, prominent in the sector sort of suggest that maybe there's a danger that impact becomes bureaucratized, and that we spend a lot of time in the sort of audit part of impact, chasing bits of paper to confirm we did this impact or that impact. And I can see that argument. But I think almost that's the problem is you have to have evidence, and therefore you are always going to go down that path. And until someone develops a piece of software that can measure impact without the need for those bits of paper, then I think we are going to be in that particular space. I think impact is here to stay. I'm not sure its proportion of the REF will increase. Future it may, but I don't think it will. I think it's probably about right now. So that side, I think the future impact will be far more focused on a greater awareness of, I would say, of the people we're impacting upon. Because within the sector, there's there's a conversation going on about improving the culture within the sector, and we all know stories about behaviour of certain individuals over in the sector and institutions, to be fair. And how sometimes that can be quite toxic, and also a whole range of issues around E&D as well. That that we can't pretend. There is huge inequality across the higher education sector, and ironically, I think the REF almost reinforces some of those inequalities. I do think there'll be a turn to look at the people that we're impacting and saying, are we helping the right people? Are we having a benefit? And are we doing it in a collaborative way? And are we just being a bit paternalistic? And I think that's where there'll be more and more questions about impact. And therefore, impact will create, I think, in itself, there will be a critique of impact that will develop, rather than the original critique, which was based on whether we should measure it or not, and whether it should happen or not. Whether we should look at it, whether it was valued or not. I think we're now going to get more sophisticated, almost sociological critique of impact will start to emerge, and I think that's really healthy. And I look forward to reading stuff on that as people start to really, sort of the counter impact movement sort of will certainly kick off.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. And so think about Salford, it feels like there's already, a number of the case studies have just ongoing work that is just growing and growing in depth and reach. So it feels like partly a big part of the challenge for us in the sector is just to keep it going, maintain the impact, develop those relationships deeper, and keep investing, really.
Well, with that, I would go as far as to say that, the sector needs impact more than sometimes the impact needs, the rest of the world needs the impact of the sector. We live in a time where, politicians aren't always friends with universities. and sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. But what impact does, it demonstrates to those same politicians where universities really add value. And it's something that politicians do appreciate, regardless of political persuasion. They can see it. We saw, of course, during the pandemic, the most famous example of impact, since Fletcher, you'd say, in terms of how that. But the important part for me was the bit that's missing from that story was all that research that had gone on years and years before, so that actually the drugs could be developed. That research had happened for years. It didn't just come out of blue sky. There had been an enormous amount of research spent so we could actually get to that point. And therefore that impact, that original research still needs to happen. You can't have impact without really high quality original research. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And that's necessary. And that then gives you the means to have the really long-term impact. I think universities will have to continue doing it. And I think universities should continue doing it. And it is the easiest way to communicate with the public the benefit that universities bring to wider society, both economically and socially. And as we get further and further in the 21st century, I'm sure that's becoming even more prominent.
One of the things I want to ask you is, looking back to sort of early years of your research, if you were to give a PhD researcher starting out today on their own research journey, what advice would you give them in terms of their own impact journey? How do they get started? What would you say to them?
I would say spend more time with the recipients, trying to understand them rather than trying to understand your research question. And I know there's a lot of pressure, but I think once you start to have a stronger sense of empathy, especially if you're doing sort of social science research in particular, or humanities for that matter, once you have a stronger sense of empathy with the people that the subject or object of your study, so to speak, then you will actually start to that will sort of trigger off thoughts of what can I do for them? What is my obligation? And then I think that sort of starts that journey towards impact. And the other thing I'd say is obviously, by all means, build a network, build the connections, etc., and try and learn from others do it. There's lots of now good examples of people that have been really impactful. Find an impact mentor. If you're not sure, by all means find a mentor for the excellence of the research, but it might be a different person you go to who really understands impact. And the university has obviously now many colleagues that are recognised through the REF as 4 and 3-star impact producers. Virtually everything the university does is of that level. So there are plenty of people to lean on and say, well, how do you do it? What do I need to do in my field? And I think an impact mentor is a really good step forward for many people.
That's a fantastic idea. I think one of the things that's also interesting is that many researchers may not fully appreciate the breadth of their potential impact because they see themselves as operating within one particular field, but actually the exercise of going through that process of thinking about and writing down and developing your own sort of impact strategy, you sort of discover the breadth of the different things that you do and the ways in which you also need to capture that evidence as well, quite varied, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think one of the ones that strikes me from the REF was looking at Ghassan Nasser's work about valves and the lead-to-cell valve code, and that was an impact case that we entered in 2014, and then obviously we entered 2021. And in 2014, the emphasis was very much on the commercialization, the IP and commercialization of it. And this time that was still there, and obviously the commercialization was much greater, therefore it would have got a high impact. But what was really fascinating was the way that also became a conversation about health as well, and about how aerosol cans with the butane compressed gas inside them, using those aerosol cans, were actually a potential health hazard. And it wasn't just that we should move away for environmental reasons. There's a personal health issue, and that moves into a public health field. And I thought it was really interesting. What was to start with a pure engineering problem. How do we not use butane gas? How do we invent a different type of nozzle for a can, and therefore the commercialization of that into a really important part of public policy in terms of health policy, and whether actually this is really not the best for human health to be using this sort of compressed gas sort of aerosols for etc. And I think that for me is that sense of the way in which even something which is seen as sort of really straight line engineering, really as far, has huge public policy implications once you start impact. Because once you start impact, you start thinking, oh, it's got this, and then there's this. So I think that's and there are many examples. So I think the, the sort of nature in which science has a huge public policy impact, which is probably unknown to many scientists, is also a big thing that we'll be looking at in the future.
That's really interesting. One of the themes that's come up in this research podcast has been just how connected disciplines are, actually. So the term artificial intelligence has come up in conversations about poetry, about autonomous vehicles, about health. It's interesting because I think we do sort of push people into a discipline or a school or a subject, but actually those connections just they feel to me much more important today than they were 20 years ago, being able to reach out beyond your discipline.
Yeah, and I think that's what impact does, because we talk a lot about interdisciplinary research, and I think that's always there. But we're all embedded in our own disciplines, and therefore we are embedded the knowledge of our disciplines, and therefore, rightly, we're all tentative about stepping into other disciplinary areas where our expertise is, fragmentary at best. And so we look for colleagues to collaborate with that are specialists in those areas, which is the right way. But what impact does, it almost says discipline is not the point. The discipline doesn't matter here. What matters is, actually the user of the service, so to speak, the person you're interacting with, and it's from their view. So you flip the lens and you're looking back on that, and I think that's why impact enables you to sort of cut across disciplines and requires multidisciplinary teams, I would say.
Yeah, I think that word empathy is so important. In all the conversations I've had with people about impact, listening seems so crucial to all of them, and really understanding the needs and the lived reality of the people working in whatever sector it is just so central, isn't it?
Absolutely. I look at my research over the years, and it has been those sort of in-depth interviews, focus groups, etc., where you spend your time listening to stories that are quite harrowing as well. You're often, because the work I was back in my day, etc., you were spending your time listening to people talking about their financial lives, and that's hard to get people to open up. But when they do open up, the lives are, just really hard to imagine if you're, a standard academic. Academic life is, despite what we may say, is a relatively comfortable living, in terms of income, compared to those that are in the poorest part, in the poorest communities, and the way in which they do, and therefore you can't help but think, what can I do? I have this knowledge. How do I use this knowledge for the betterment of this group? In a way in which is not for me, but it's for them. And I think that's really important. So listening to those stories are absolutely crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we're unfortunately almost out of time, but I feel I must ask you a bit about the future. So looking forward to the next REF cycle, what are your sort of hopes for Salford? Where do you think we're going?
Okay, I think the first thing I'd say is that REF is great and it's the league table, etc. But we, at the same time, what matters most is that we produce really high quality work, high quality research, and high quality impact. So the REF sort of is a sort of audit of that process. Are we doing it? It isn't of itself anything. I think that's really important that we never forget that point. And the job of people like myself is to give people like yourselves and the rest of the researchers across the university the space, time, and resources to do their best work. That's ultimately our function. But looking forward, I think, a couple things I would say. The first is the university is not going to compromise on quality. We have set our stall out. It is about high quality research, and that's absolutely. We do want to see more people being research active. I think that's really important, but we have to maintain quality whilst doing that. So developing the next generation of researchers, give them the right training support, mentor them properly, get them into the right place. That's absolutely need to be. The other thing I would say is that impact will only be more intensively important for Salford. I'm absolutely clear about that. I joked about, missing out on 50th place by 0.01, but it's more the point that actually I genuinely feel that impact is what Salford should be about as an institution. That our commitment to industrial collaboration says that if you looked at the REF, what bit would you look at? You would look at impact. That's what we're here for. That's what we were created for. That's our DNA. We should aim to be, an absolute leader in impact, both within, internally, but also across the sector as well. People say Salford's the place to go if you really want to understand what impact is, and I genuinely think that's the thing. So they're the sort of things I look for in the next period.
I think that's a wonderful way to end the episode, and certainly concur with all of that. It's fantastic, and I must admit, genuinely inspiring to speak to our colleagues that have put so much commitment into their impact over their entire careers, and especially those that are just starting out as well. So thanks so much for being here, Karl. It's great to have your perspective and to learn more about your background and your research as well. And that award is just fantastic. So congratulations, and moving into the summer in a very positive way, I think.
I hope so, and that's great to talk to Andy, and good luck with the rest of the podcast. They've been fascinating to watch and listen.
Thanks a lot, Karl. See you soon.
See ya.